welcome to Useful Idiots Special Thanksgiving Edition. I'm Katie Halper.
And I'm Aaron Mate. And we have a very special show. This week, we are releasing our Thursday Throwdown for everybody. The Thursday Throwdown is something we do every single week, only for our Useful Idiot subscribers on Substack. But this week, we're going to release it widely so everybody can watch it. And what it is basically it's your midweek dose of media madness, all the funny clips that we can't review on Monday morning because they happen after Monday. We make fun of in the Thursday Throwdown. So that's what we're doing in this special Thanksgiving Throwdown this week.
This is our Thanksgiving Throwdown. So we want to make sure that you had stuff to be thankful for. So that's what we're doing. We're providing you with the Thanksgiving, basically. You're welcome, everyone. And again, this is something that you get usually when you are a paying subscriber to usefulidiots.substack.com. But we're not doing our regular show today, so we are giving you the Thursday Throwdown. What we are doing, though, is Thursday Throwdown, plus we're giving you an extended interview with Norman Finkelstein. Now, people who subscribe, we already gave you an extended interview with Norman Finkelstein, right? That's what you got for being a subscriber. So now non-subscribers, you get to see that interview. But subscribers, we haven't forgotten about you either. Luckily, Norman Finkelstein is a prolific scholar, and not just a prolific scholar, but a prolific speaker. So we have an extended interview for you as well.
Everybody gets a Thanksgiving bonus. Norman Finkelstein. Wow. What a bounty. What a harvest. So
what a harvest. Do you celebrate Thanksgiving, Aaron?
Well, I mean, I go to Thanksgiving gatherings, but I'm Canadian, so it just doesn't have the significance for me that it does for all my American friends. But also, I'm very influenced by my, childhood. And when I was a kid, one of my favorite artists was Ice-T, the rapper and actor. And he has a line on his album OG that says this. He says, "I work hard for my living, but I don't celebrate bullshit Thanksgiving. Sit around like some fool and eat turkey. That's the day your forefathers jerked me." Wow. And so that's what I recite every single year on Thanksgiving. That's my annual
at the table,
Thanksgiving tradition. Yes,
no matter where you are.
Yes. Yeah. But it's incredibly, it's amazing how, things you hear as a kid will stay with you with the rest of your life. And that's one of those things where every Thanksgiving, that's what I think about is that line. And I learned, that's where I learned a lot about the actual history of Thanksgiving and the slaughter of the natives. I mean, you learn about things like that, not necessarily in books for some people, but in music. And that's where I learned about that sort of history from Ice-T.
Right. You got Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States, or you got Ice-T.
Yeah. I mean, there's all different ways to get information in.
Yeah. Some people come to Useful Idiots for information.
That's right. Yeah. All right. Well, so this week for the Thursday Throwdown, we are going to start with Jon Stewart. And Jon Stewart has a show called The Problem. It's on Apple. And this week he welcomed Condoleeza Rice and Hillary Clinton, two former secretaries of state. And I got to say, this was sad for me, this whole episode, because Jon Stewart's someone I really admire. I think he's hilarious. And he was very formative for me during the Iraq War. Yeah. I would watch the Daily Show every single night. And, Jon Stewart was there to make fun of the Bush administration's drive to invade Iraq. And I think has displayed over the years, some real courage on some political issues that he was willing to take a stand on, including on, not just standing up for veterans who have been poisoned by these wars that people like Hillary Clinton and Condoleezza Rice have caused, but also, speaking out relatively early on before it was like politically okay on the Israel-Palestine issue.
Yes, he was ahead of the curve on that.
So, I really like Jon Stewart. And so that's why watching him give this warm welcome to Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton and letting them spew lies that I feel like in a previous era he would have debunked. And he did debunk, especially when it comes to the Iraq War. I just thought was really unfortunate.
Yeah, pretty disappointing. I mean, it's called The Problem with Jon Stewart. Sounds like we have a problem with Jon Stewart.
On this front, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Yes. All right. So let's go to a bit of Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton speaking to Jon Stewart.
And this is all, and again, this is not to relitigate, honestly. What happened in Libya, we take out an authoritarian leader through a military action, but we don't have the civic institutions that you talk about to back that up, and it creates instability. Or what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's a chaos that is born of that, right? Suddenly you have 35 million displaced individuals who migrate towards Europe. Europe feels the heat of what they consider this other that's coming to their borders. It creates the impetus for more populist, more illiberal, more authoritarian impulses to then gain traction democratically. Those are direct results of American military intervention.
So Jon Stewart is pushing back here on his guests in raising the consequences of U.S. military interventions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. Yeah. But note how narrowly his objection is framed. And this is like the problem I have with liberal media in general. When U.S. policy, like invading other countries and destroying them, is criticized, it's always on these very narrow grounds. Like, we didn't properly prepare for the aftermath. We didn't properly build institutions for these governments to rebuild with and to grow with in the aftermath of the chaos. And that in turn created refugees, and that in turn led to the rise of authoritarian populists in the West. Right. That's a consequence of these actions. But when you're only looking at the consequence, and by the way, that's only one consequence. Another consequence is you're killing millions of people, which is by far the most important consequence, which he doesn't mention. But also, when you're only looking at the consequences, then you're essentially legitimizing the underlying enterprise. You're saying that, yes, like, you're raising no objection whatsoever to the war itself. Well, what makes it legitimate to invade Iraq or Libya? What gives us the right to do that? Are we divine emperors who rule the world and can do whatever we want unless the consequences are bad to us? So the presumption in this question presupposes that we have the right to invade these countries in the first place, when there's something called international law and the UN Charter, which says you can't do that unless you're acting in self-defense. And he's just completely ignoring that, and also ignoring the worst consequences, which, far worse than refugees and fueling the rise of authoritarian populists in the West. You're destroying countries and killing people. In Libya, you're reimposing slavery. In Iraq, you're bombing sanitation plants and water plants and electricity grids. And before that, you're imposing sanctions that kill tens of thousands of people. And there's nothing here from him in this whole interview that challenges any of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're saying that he's only looking at consequences. We obviously have to look at the consequences, but we need to look at the kind of immediate consequences as opposed to the secondary consequences, or the indirect consequences, I guess, would be the distinction.
No, but I'm also saying you can't ask a question only about consequences.
As opposed to the actual the invasion per se, not just what happened because of that, but the invasion per se being illegal, unjust, and immoral.
Like, if Jon Stewart was watching a Kremlin propagandist, right, someone in Russia talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and he heard them say, well, are we thinking properly about the consequences for us here and how this will impact us? And are there going to be too many refugees, more than we want and than we can handle? He would immediately recognize that to be based on a premise that he wouldn't accept, because it presupposes that Russia has the right to invade Ukraine in the first place.
And it dismisses the lives of Ukrainians, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And it just looks at the impact on the West, or the kind of the blowback, as opposed to, I think that, like, the very destabilization is a problem. The invasion is a problem. The overthrow is a problem. The total collapse of the state that happens, which is something that people also never focus on.
Yeah, and what right do we have to do it? I mean, nobody in Iraq voted for the U.S. to invade them, or Libya, or Afghanistan. The U.S. did it anyway because it ignored international law. And it's just amazing to me when you interview these people that you can't raise that question. You only can raise the question of, well, did we properly plan for it? Was there a good enough plan in place? Did we think about the consequences? No, it's not about that.
Like the cleanup, almost. Was the cleanup good?
Yes.
No, and it's just obviously very like Eurocentric, West-centric, right? This in turn, what it does in turn to creating right-wing populism in Europe. as opposed to what it does again in the countries that we're actually
Of course. Yeah, of course.
invading, yeah,
Of
and
course.
overthrowing. But you
Yeah.
know, it's so funny. I was like so excited to actually hear someone bring up Libya. Like, just it's a low bar, but I'll give him props for even bringing up Libya because it's very rarely brought up, except for by the right wing and Benghazi.
But you know what? He has a whole staff of people,
Yeah.
and they either did no research or they did do research and they decided to raise no important points, because
Right.
on all the things that Hillary Clinton said, and we'll hear some of them about defending Libya, it was a lie. I mean, she's whitewashing a war of aggression that left Libya in ruins. He had nothing to challenge any of her points, which I'm sure they could have expected that she would make if they're going to raise the issue of Libya. And so,
Right.
again, it's such a waste of someone, I think, who was just shown the capacity in the past to be adversarial and skeptical. And it's like, to me, watching this interview was, I don't care about what Hillary Clinton and Condoleeza Rice are saying, because I know they're going to
Of course.
repeat propaganda, because that's what they do. I mean, they're former officials who are in very senior roles. But Jon Stewart, I mean, to me, it's just, if you're going to do something like this, if you're not going to be willing to ask the most basic questions and be skeptical, then why do it? Like, why debate yourself like that? But anyway, let's hear more of what this interview has to say. So this is Hillary Clinton responding to Jon Stewart.
Let me
Yeah,
just
go ahead.
finish,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah,
I'll let Condi talk about that. Look, I think it's very hard to lump even the examples you just put together into sort of one bucket and say that then caused dislocation. That dislocation meant refugees to the shores of Europe, and that, because remember, Angela Merkel took 1 million Syrian refugees. The United States had nothing to do with Bashar al-Assad joining forces with Russia and Iran to suppress legitimate dissent.
So Hillary says the U.S. has nothing to do with what happened in Syria, and refugees pointing out that was the fault of Russia and Iran joining with Syria to crush legitimate dissent. Well, she's leaving something out. Russia and Iran didn't go into Syria to crush peaceful protesters. They went in because the U.S. and its allies spent billions of dollars funding an insurgency, the most well-armed insurgency really in decades. The CIA alone spent around $1 billion a year. $1 out of every $15 in the CIA's budget was spent on the Syria dirty war. That's according to Edward Snowden. U.S. officials bragged that death squads trained by the U.S. in Syria killed over 100,000 Syrian soldiers. You can read that in the Washington Post from David Ignatius. So for Hillary to say the U.S. had nothing to do with that, this was just Iran and Russia and Syria cracking down on peaceful protesters, it's such a lie. They were fighting back against a dirty war that we helped initiate. That's just a fact. And she completely glosses over that when this is one of the most expensive covert programs in CIA history. And of course, Jon Stewart has nothing to say to that. He lets her say that lie, but it's completely fake. And in fact, look, just to give you an example, John Kerry privately admitted the real reason why Russia went into Syria. It had nothing to do with Russia trying to crack down on peaceful protesters. As John Kerry explained, and we'll play the clip now, John Kerry said the reason Russia came in to Syria is because the U.S. was sitting back and watching as ISIS was growing and threatening Damascus. And Kerry explained that the U.S. thought that the more ISIS threatens Damascus, the more that might force Assad to negotiate his way out of power and let in a regime backed by the U.S. And then Kerry says, that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want an ISIS government. And for ISIS, he uses the word Daesh. So let's watch that clip.
The reason Russia came in is because ISIL was getting stronger. Daesh was threatening the possibility of going to Damascus and so forth. And that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want a Daesh government. And they supported Assad. And we know that this was growing. We were watching. We saw that Daesh was growing in strength, and we thought Assad was threatened. We thought, however, we could probably manage, that Assad might then negotiate. Instead of negotiating, you got Assad. You got Putin to support him.
So that's John Kerry. He's speaking privately. He doesn't actually know he's being recorded. That was in September 2016. He's meeting with some Syrian opposition activists, and that's what he admitted. So in public, people like Hillary Clinton say that Russia came in to crush peaceful protests in Syria. In private, they admit the truth. And that's when John Kerry says that actually Russia came in because we were watching as ISIS was growing, and Russia didn't want an ISIS government. Okay, so that's the real reason. And these facts are out there. And Jon Stewart has a whole staff of people that can find these facts for him. And instead,
I think you need to hire Aaron.
Well, instead, someone like Hillary Clinton could come on and just repeat this complete lie that the U.S. had nothing to do with what happened in Syria and not get challenged for it. And that speaks to a broader refusal by the U.S. media to really cover what happened in Syria accurately, that this is a hugely expensive and massive covert program that we still don't know the full details for, but what we know is pretty damning. And Hillary Clinton can get away with simply whitewashing it because the U.S. media just won't cover it.
Also, she does this kind of intellectual sleight of hand that I think can be seductive. It's a total trick. She's like, well, we can't put those three things in the same bucket. And she kind of is going to tell us why they're so different, as if the question of American hegemony or U.S. control and interventionism doesn't apply to all three of them. There should be a name for that when you kind of pretend that you're it's a kind of technocratic response, right? You're going to show your expertise and how nuanced you are in your classification of these things. And that just is a deflection to distract from the fact that who gives a shit? These things are united in important ways.
Yeah, and of course, they're all incredibly similar. They're all hegemonic war campaigns that the U.S. undertakes, not because they care about the civilians there, actually out of direct hostility to the well-being of civilians there in carrying out these policies, invading countries, bombing these countries, knowing the horrible consequences, and sitting back and watching, as John Kerry details, as groups like ISIS take advantage and grow. And he says that we're watching as ISIS was threatening to match this, but we thought we could manage because we thought that would
worse than just watching, right? Because we actually were aiding.
Yes, we were fueling the insurgency, which ISIS was a part of. And U.S. weapons ended up in the hands of ISIS. The U.S. didn't directly arm ISIS, but they armed people who then joined up with ISIS. Yeah, and ISIS got a lot of U.S. military equipment and equipment provided by the U.S. and its allies because of that. And the U.S. knew all this. This was all warned about in internal memos that the public saw years later, but these officials saw right at the time. And they just didn't care.
That Hillary does is that she brings in Russia because she knows people have like a Pavlovian response to Russia.
Of course.
Because that's not really related at all to what she's being asked about at all.
Yeah, well, let's hear more of what she has to say.
She took 1 million refugees, and Germany did not turn into Hungary. But
Germany feels that pressure, and you see those right-wing parties start to.
Not really. No, it's minor league compared to
certainly compared to Hungary. Yeah, compared to that,
and because of strong institutions.
Orban didn't take any refugees. I mean, he built the walls, kept them out. He didn't take any refugees. He used the issue not to solve a problem, but to consolidate power for himself.
Right.
And so I think that there are lessons always to be learned from any of these situations, and woe on us if we don't learn the lessons. And just very briefly on Libya, because that was on my watch.
But this is not again.
No. But I want to make a larger point because Gaddafi was a bad actor. Everybody knew he was a bad actor, and he threatened to kill his people by cockroaches. The United States was actually the supporter of European countries through NATO and the Arab League, which for the very first time came and said, we want to be part of trying to protect the people of Libya now. So I feel that particular intervention, we had certain capabilities militarily that nobody else had, which we used to assist them. But, the Emiratis were flying and the Jordanians were flying, et cetera. The problem, and this is where I think you make a really good point. The problem is, Gaddafi's gone.
Moral beacons.
His horrible prisons are emptied. What comes next?
Right.
Well, slave markets. That's one of the things that comes next, right?
Exactly. Slave markets, which they return to Libya, which she doesn't mention. And she bases all this on lies. So she talks about Gaddafi was threatening to kill his people like cockroaches. And what she's referring to is the official pretext for U.S. intervention, which the U.S. got a Security Council resolution, which was passed, it was authorized, that allowed for the creation of a no-fly zone around Benghazi to protect the people of Benghazi, because on the alleged basis that Gaddafi was going to commit a massacre there. Now, there's been investigations done of this. The British Parliament did an investigation of Benghazi, and they actually found that there was no evidence that Libya was going to go and commit a large-scale massacre in Benghazi. That this allegation was basically invented to justify this UN Security Council resolution. And what happened after the U.S. got that UN Security Council resolution, allowing for NATO intervention, is they went way beyond it. They went way beyond Benghazi, and they used it as an excuse to bomb way deeper into Libya, to act as the air force for the rebels, and use that to carry out regime change. That's actually what happened. And meanwhile, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, undermined multiple attempts by Gaddafi for negotiations. Now, there's a New York Times article about this back in 2016. There was a two-part New York Times article that shows in depth how Hillary Clinton received overtures from Libya to have negotiations to avoid all the kind of violence that Hillary Clinton claimed that she was trying to prevent. But Clinton ignored all that and sabotaged diplomacy and wanted full-scale regime change. And that's why, in the end, we saw her in that infamous clip saying, "We came, he saw, he died," after Gaddafi was murdered by the insurgents, who, by the way, just like in Syria, were dominated by jihadist militants. That's just a reality of the insurgency that the U.S. supported inside of Libya and inside of Syria. And that's part of the reason why Libya has become so chaotic after that happened. So the criticism of Hillary Clinton, U.S., is not just they didn't have a plan for afterwards. That's a very minor part of it. The bigger crime was undermining diplomacy, was lying about the pretext for it, and then using that pretext to go much further and carry out regime change.
And Russia was upset, right? Because they felt that they'd been tricked into voting for this.
Yes, and this is actually a major point of tension between the U.S. and Russia, and it's why Putin's attitude toward the U.S. has really soured. And one of the reasons why is because the U.S. came to Russia and said, "Listen, if you don't veto this measure at the UN Security Council, we're not going to carry out regime change. We just want to use this to have a no-fly zone to protect the people of Benghazi." And so Medvedev, who was the Russian president at the time, went along with this, and then Russia saw as the U.S. then used this resolution, which Russia allowed to go through, to carry out regime change, and then saw Gaddafi get sodomized with a bayonet. And Hillary Clinton celebrate this, and that really angered Putin, and I think has helped worsen relations between the U.S. and Russia over the years.
Really disgusting. Yeah.
So, this not only had major consequences for Libya, obviously, but also for, U.S.-Russia relations. And it's one of the reasons why relations between U.S. and Russia have worsened. And it's why Russia doesn't trust the U.S. Because of incidents like this. And again, Hillary Clinton just gets a complete free pass in repeating the lies that justified it here.
That's always a problem, because there's always a vacuum. Because look, dictators don't allow institutions to flourish. So when you take the dictator out, there are no institutions.
That's right.
So but the question becomes: do you then say let Gaddafi go ahead and kill his people because it's going to be hard afterwards? Or in our case, we thought Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. You're going to let that continue, or are you going to take him out and then do the best that you can in helping people to recover? You have to recognize that it's going to be hard.
So again, an outright lie. And Jon Stewart, whatever, if he doesn't know the details about Syria or Libya, he knows when it comes to Iraq, what she says there, that we thought Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. He knows that's a lie. He knows that meanwhile, the U.S. was concocting this so-called intelligence claiming that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction by doing things like torturing people into saying it, and by relying on sources like Curveball, which turned out to be, as they knew at the time, completely phony. And he knows that. He covered it. And he just sits there and lets her say that with no challenge whatsoever. And again, Condoleeza Rice repeats the lie that Gaddafi was going to kill his people unless the U.S. intervened, which again, the British Parliament investigated this and found no evidence for it. So did Amnesty International too, by the way. So all this is propaganda used to retroactively justify a criminal war and the atrocities that followed. And these two figures behind these disastrous wars get a free pass to just repeat their propaganda.
Right. Also, of course, the reasons for intervening are humanitarian. I mean, I don't know if anyone actually believes that. It's certainly not true. But the fact that we went in because we didn't want Gaddafi killing his people, or we went into Iraq because of WMDs, it's a joke. Like, anyone who thinks that the United States is inspired by altruism or justice or concern for human suffering has quite a rude awakening.
Exactly. And, again, I just couldn't believe that Jon Stewart's sitting there and letting Condoleeza Rice say something that he knows is demonstrably false.
Yeah.
I mean, he knows that. And so I don't know. It's tough to watch.
To recognize that it's going to be hard once you take the dictator out. But John, it's a little bit of a false choice to say, well, then just leave the dictator in place because it won't be chaotic. It may not be chaotic.
I guess what I'm saying is,
it may not be chaotic.
If we take that role on,
but it might be brutal against the people.
If we take that role on, can we sustain as a country? When you think about the Soviet Union's collapse, they overextended and they got in an arms race with us, and they had all these satellites. Are we overextending America's power, especially militarily, when you talk about an $800 billion defense budget?
So, first of all, let me say also about Condi, where she talks about the dictator has no institutions. Yes. With Gaddafi, yes, he certainly ruled Libya in a really idiosyncratic way, and Libya didn't have the kind of the governance institutions that other countries have. There's truth to that. But Libya also had free education, healthcare, and a pretty high standard of living compared to the rest of the region. And all of that was wiped out by the U.S. intervention. All of it. Yeah.
I mean, I was going to say, like, what is she an expert in Libyan institutions? Because if she knew about Libyan institutions or industries or sectors, then she'd have to admit that they were not this totally backwards dictator-run thing, which is what she wants. She's relying really heavily here on like a lot of tropes, also like racist tropes about third world dictators.
Yeah, and again, this is the consequence of what happens when you reduce a state to just a caricature of their leader. But a state is not just their leader. And yeah, I mean, again, I wouldn't want to live under a leader like Gaddafi if I had a choice of what kind of government to live under, obviously. But in the context of Libya, Gaddafi did have a government that provided some basics for its people. And this war destroyed all of that. Just like in Syria, before the dirty war began, Syria had high levels of healthcare, of food self-sufficiency, of education, and all that has been destroyed. Now it's horrible now in Syria because it's also under U.S. sanctions, so it can't rebuild after 10 years of war. And so some hospitals don't even have power all day. And some people only have power for a few hours a week, if even that, among many other horrible calamities. And so that's what ultimately happens to institutions when the U.S. and its allies come in and with these interventions, is they destroy all these institutions. And so, yes, these aren't like governments that are models of democracy, but the far worse consequence to these countries is when foreign intervention comes and destroys the basic elements of the state that keep a country functioning.
They're trying to dress it up in a kind of NGO technocratic discourse where they care about institutions and good governance, and that's what's really bad. But also, it's just such bullshit, because obviously if we cared about human rights and dictators and the form of government, we'd be invading Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's one of
just one example. I mean, it's so clearly not about that.
Yeah, no, of course, and we wouldn't be arming Saudi Arabia as it commits mass murder in Yemen. Yeah. All right, let's hear a bit more of this, and then mercifully move on.
Defense budget.
Let's assume instead of being in a podcast studio, we were in the Situation Room, or in the tank in the Defense Department, wherever we were. Right. Okay. And we're saying, okay, what do you see on the horizon? Well, North Korea is shooting these missiles over our ally, Japan.
Right.
China is trying to build up its blue water navy so that it can compete with us anywhere in the world. You've got, the Russia-China relationship. It's tricky, but we have to watch it really carefully because we don't know where that might lead. We've got Iran, still a very bad actor, and probably in addition to killing their people, will cause some external problems in order to take people's minds off it. We have a lot of issues. So do we just sit back and hope for the best, or do we try to be positioned in enough places with enough support that we can be a good ally to those who are counting on us?
And you have to watch the potential rise of terrorism again. So you have a lot on your plate.
I love that they're really concerned with the creation of terrorism. I mean, like the war in Iraq, the torture that was committed in Abu Ghraib. I mean, those were just great PR campaigns for terrorists to recruit people.
Yeah, I mean, when the so-called war on terror began, with the support of Hillary Clinton and certainly, under people like Condoleezza Rice, Al-Qaeda was concentrated in a very small area of Afghanistan and neighboring Pakistan. It's since spread pretty much, across the globe. But certainly in Iraq, the U.S. war in Iraq did, wonders for Al-Qaeda and then ISIS, which was born out of that. And so the idea that these people are concerned about terrorism, and again, going back to Jon Stewart's question, he says, well, if we do all this, can we handle the consequence to ourselves? Are we overextending ourselves? Again, it's a very narrow tactical question that presupposes the legitimacy of the underlying enterprise. But what right do we have to invade other countries, to starve and kill children in foreign countries because we don't like their governments? He doesn't ask that question. And when you don't ask that question, and then you're presupposing the fundamental right of something that I think is very immoral and criminal. Accordingly, you let war criminals get away with not only whitewashing the reasons for carrying out these policies, but get away with justifying them and making the case for an even bigger international footprint, as Hillary Clinton is doing there.
After Afghanistan and Iraq, which we did for security reasons, not because we wanted to spread democracy at gunpoint, but for security reasons.
Although ultimately we were told that spreading democracy would make the world safer because freer countries would
I think if you actually look at the record, democratic countries actually don't invade their neighbors. Democratic countries don't harbor terrorists. Democratic countries don't use weapons of mass destruction.
Right. We invade countries farther away, not countries on our borders.
Yeah. And, but the U.S. has invaded neighbors. Like Panama is a neighbor. The U.S. invaded Panama under George H.W. Bush, and has invaded Haiti. And so, everything she's saying there, and democracy.
Just a little bit more. I mean, we're a little bit more neighborhoody, more neighborly, a little bit more neighborly, and that our neighbors are like a couple buildings down as opposed to like right next to us.
Yeah. And also, when she says that, democratic countries don't harbor terrorists, U.S. has harbored plenty of terrorists. First of all the Central American generals who killed their people in mass numbers in the terror wars of the 80s under Reagan, a lot of them went and live in the U.S.
I mean, the idea that we don't harbor terrorists, which we do. I mean, Posada Carriles is just one example of this Cuban terrorist who we allowed to hide basically in Miami. We've worked with tons of terrorists. I mean, we've done more than harbor them, but we have harbored them. We've worked with them. We've collaborated with them. We've armed them, all over Latin America.
So that's just a lie. And then she says that democratic countries don't use weapons of mass destruction. Well, the U.S. is the only country in the world that's dropped an atomic bomb on civilians.
What was that?
In Japan. So
does she not consider the atomic bomb a weapon of mass destruction?
It just, this is, again, in this Russiagate Trump era, neocons have completely co-opted liberals to the point where they can say stuff like this. And because the neocon agenda now has become normalized, I guess people like Jon Stewart feel, intimidated into challenging it, and feel as if they do challenge it, then they're somehow maybe helping Trump. I don't know how he justifies this interview to himself, but I'd love to hear it one day. So yeah, maybe he'll explain it. And again, and she says we invaded Afghanistan and Iraq for security reasons. Afghanistan you want to argue that the U.S. was justified to invade Afghanistan, then you have to overlook the fact that the Taliban actually offered to hand over bin Laden if some evidence could be provided that he was behind 9/11, or if the U.S. was willing to commit to. I think the demand was that he go to a Muslim country for trial there, or so, it was something like that. And the U.S. and the U.S. completely ignored that.
Muslim
In fact,
country,
in fact, Donald Rumsfeld said we don't negotiate with terrorists, and so they ignored that, and then decided to invade Afghanistan instead. And Iraq, I mean, nobody serious anymore pretends that was for security reasons. That was a lie, and Jon Stewart knows that, and he lets her get away with saying it. He's basically tearing up his own legacy of standing up to the Iraq War by letting this fly unchallenged. I don't know what he was thinking here.
He did give a really softball interview to Donald Rumsfeld. In fact, it was such a softball interview that he publicly said he regretted it.
All right. Well, I hope he publicly says he regrets this interview, because he's doing the exact same thing. He's letting her get away with lies that he knows are lies. And I just don't understand what possible explanation he has for that and why he agreed to do this. I think it's so humiliating for him. And disappointed. You know, I'm disappointed. I'm a big fan. I really like Jon Stewart. And so I'm angry. This interview really saddens me because he's meant a lot to me over the years. And I just see him trampling on what makes him good. And that just sucks.
Yeah.
It sucks to watch.
John, apologize to the world. Apologize to Aaron. It's not too late to turn this around. Well, that was heartbreaking. So let's move on to something a little more lighthearted.
As we know, Nancy Pelosi recently announced her retirement as House Speaker, and she was then the recipient of some very fawning praise on corporate media channels like MSNBC. So let's go to one panel. This is from the 11th hour with Stephanie Ruhle, where she had a panel of people to sing Nancy Pelosi's praises. So this is some of what they said.
Out of there, and she's got this red coat on, glasses, and you know what? She kicked ass, and she took names, and she looked like it. And I thought, you know, honestly, I don't care if you're Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or you're Marjorie Taylor Greene. She paved the road to normalize powerful women in Congress. And that's
1,000%. And she understood the power of dress. She looked amazing. So the bar is going to get real low in the building when she leaves on that score. One, she gave me 3 or 4 of my favorite moments in modern political discourse. That moment with Trump across the table. She pointed at him like scolding a child, ripping the address up. And then, of course, the tomato red coat.
Yes.
And there was a third one.
This one.
Oh, Donnie.
So I just love that. I love when this whole table of grown adults all at the same time does the Nancy
impersonate
clap.
her. Well, what's so amazing about that is that they basically are praising her, and they're praising how she was a trailblazer for women. And then what do they say next? Her coat was amazing. Like that's what they're focusing on. Their feminist critique, their feminist analysis of Nancy Pelosi includes her coats, her fabulous red coat, and also the totally superficial optics-based things that she did. This and ripping up the paper. It's like totally substance-free, which is just so funny and ironic for people who are trying to talk about gender. They just focus on absolutely superficial, aesthetic, cosmetic things.
So true. So true. But that's what ultimately this world is about. It's about optics and branding, and not about actual policies.
Exactly. And Nancy herself actually said out loud, she's like, remember that day I wore that blue suit and I was so rude to Trump? She said that during that podcast with Hillary Clinton, the same podcast where she was saying that that Hillary Clinton said she wants to see Vladimir Putin's phone logs to see if he was calling Trump during January 6th.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these people actually say these things out loud, not just about Pelosi, but she says it about herself. You know, they're just, it speaks to what people disliked about Trump in large part. I mean, Trump is an odious person and politician who has a lot of blood on his hands, but so much of the media's obsession with him was based on a kind of aesthetic thing, behavioral thing, that he was so lacking in decorum, right? So this is like the other side of it. You know, absolutely. Nancy was the decorum queen.
Yes.
Slay queen, yeah. That was so, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe people got so excited about that and read so much into that. She probably wasn't even giving him side eye. She was probably just literally clapping for him. When she ripped the paper, she was at least trying to be do nothing. She's like, I'll fund his budget. I'll vote for his budget, but I won't. But I'll rip up his speech. I'm sure she freed a lot of children from cages when she ripped that piece of paper up.
She gave a standing ovation to Juan Guaido when Trump introduced him at that State of the Union speech. Guaido being the Venezuelan political, politician, you can call him, who Trump was trying to install as Venezuela's new leader. And Nancy Pelosi, the shade queen, gave Juan Guaido a standing ovation and stood side by side with Trump in that policy of trying to overthrow Venezuela's government and imposing murder sanctions in the process. So that's how much shade Nancy Pelosi really threw at Trump. It was very performative, and that's what she gets celebrated for now is just performance. And so, yeah, what a fitting way for her to be covered. It's just based on her aesthetics.
Really ridiculous. Thanks. You really did wonders for women, guys.
All right. Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to Thursday Throwdown.
Thanks for tuning in. Yeah.
If you're celebrating Thanksgiving, have a great one, and we'll see you next week.
Hello, thank you so much for listening to and watching Useful Idiots. For full episodes and extended interviews, please subscribe at usefulidiots.substack.com. You can subscribe on YouTube at youtube.com/usefulidiots for clips, live streams, and full episodes. Also, subscribe to us wherever you find your podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at UsefulIdiotPod and use the hashtag UsefulIdiotsPod. Join us Mondays at 10 a.m. for the Useful Idiots Monday Morning Show, where we discuss the Sunday morning news shows so you don't have to watch them.